Well, back to the coronavirus. In this unprecedented time when so much in our lives has been turned inside out, many are asking, is this time for a massive reset of the way we organise our work? Millions of people around the world are losing their livelihoods, and many governments on the right and left are introducing huge bailouts, including paying wages and providing stimulus packages. So is it time for a reset? I've been speaking to Professor Mariana Mazzucato, founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, and to James Carafano of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C.
I think the answer has to be yes, because going back to normal assumes normal was good. And in many economies, it wasn't good, both in terms of the kind of obvious metrics around inequality, but more so in terms of, for example, corporate governance. We know that in many cases, not all, we've had overly financialized companies actually not kind of reinvesting their profits back into productive capacity, more and more used for areas like share buybacks. But also governments weren't great. I mean, I personally am a big critic of how government policy gets done. So I think the challenge that we now have, which is both an urgent challenge because households and businesses need help today, is also a moment that we can do a reset precisely because so much of what's being done today and tomorrow and yesterday are in fact different types of help, if you want, that governments are providing different groups. And if we can actually embed in those relationships a better way of kind of, in quotes, doing capitalism, wouldn't that be great? Couldn't we really organize public-private partnerships in a more symbiotic way that really tackle the concrete areas like vaccines, but also all sorts of different problems that we have around digital online education for kids who are home, loneliness of the elderly? We can use things like government procurement, for example, to crowd in different solutions in the private sector and the third sector. But that means to be goal-oriented, purpose-driven. And I think that's the big reset that I'm calling for.
James Carafano, an opportunity for a major reset?
There are lots of interesting thoughts there. I think, though, the answer from a practical perspective is no. The big reason for that is we've never done this before. We've had depressions, we've had recessions, we've had wars and nation rebuilding after. We've never had a suppression before. So we've never had a condition where most of the world's economies simply turned the off button. And we don't know what's going to happen when we turn the button back on. So people go into this future with very, very little confidence. So this notion of very thoughtful planning and let's rethink this and everything, I don't think that's the way most countries are going to go. And quite honestly, from a risk management perspective, I wouldn't blame them if that's not what they've done. I think the number one thing countries will do was want to turn the switch back on and get their economies up and running. And then we'll go back to the debates about fairness, equality, economic distribution, the future of the free market.
Governments are already doing what had been previously unthinkable. Governments in the industrialized world taking over the wage bill for so many of the companies, bailing out, intervening in the economy in ways they never did before. So even when we go back, as you say, when that phase comes, it's going to be different anyway.
Oh, well, there's plenty of precedent for that. I mean, we've done a lot of things.
At this scale?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can go back to the Great Depression and the New Deal in the United States. Even post 9/11, we did quite a bit. And certainly after the 2000 recession, when we did major investments in the United States, which were quite controversial. We'll see how those things work out. But here's where I actually would agree. There are a lot of things that people were forced to do during this, and there's a lot of goodness in that. So, for example, telehealth, distributed education, different kinds of economic and business practices that were evolved. But some small businesses, the ones that have stayed open, been essential workers, they've actually been helped, and people have kind of seen the value of shopping locally, for example, and small economy, distributed economies. So I don't think we're going to be the same. I'm not arguing that whatsoever. I'm just saying that the notion of kind of a planned transition to something different, I just don't see that happening. And the other thing I think is, everybody's not going through this the same. It's not like Independence Day where we're all in this together and we're going to go out, fly out and beat the aliens. Some countries are coming out of this in much, much better shape than others. In the United States, for example, people are highly critical of that we've got one of the most free market healthcare systems. But on the other hand, one of the lowest mortality rates in the world, most testing in the world, never at a loss for beds. Medical system did not get overwhelmed. Now, granted, a lot of things, those were done with not the traditional ways of doing things, but in some cases, the free market actually stepped in and produced additional capacities that we didn't even know we had. So I'm not sure everybody's going to take out of this the notion that it's time for a great restructuring?
Well, so I think that it's wrong to think that it's either think this through properly or kind of that immediate assistance. Today, yesterday, tomorrow, there is immediate assistance being provided, which is absolutely important. How we structure that assistance, it's not about having a big philosophical discussion after dinner. It's about actually creating contracts that actually make sense. So, for example, the airlines industry, there's immediate ways to actually make sure that those bailouts are in fact conditional on the airlines becoming more green. They are, in fact, some of the greatest polluters, and that doesn't mean sitting around for a long time thinking about how to do that. I do think there's an opportunity precisely because this is the moment that government is being asked and is doing so much to make sure that it's not done in a lazy kind of just hand out guarantees, subsidies, and bailouts kind of way. Let's not forget what got us to the moon was not just NASA and a public, entity, the state. It was also lots of innovation from General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola. And that was done through really ambitious procurement policy. And government today is purchasing in all sorts of different solutions, both on the medical side, personal equipment side, and again, all those other areas from education to social services, really using that power to drive through innovation, which can also help then the recovery. This is the moment to actually implement that.
And James, just to pick up on a phrase that Mariana used at the start, a better way of doing capitalism. As you know, even before this unprecedented crisis of a generation, there was a big debate about whether capitalism there'd be a rethinking of capitalism and how it was creating inequalities within countries and around the world. There are those, and I think Mariana seems to be part of those, who say, let's use this as an opportunity to keep that thinking going.
Many of these transitions ideas are quite controversial and they're quite problematic. The notion of let's get a better partnership between government and the private sector, for example, let's set better rules for that. Often that can turn into corporatism. And there's an argument that many of the problems in the world today are problems in just letting evil, greedy capitalists running around doing what they want. There's also problems with managing the capitalists. If in the way of managing them, you're actually creating worse outcomes, undermining productivity, picking winners and losers. And so I do worry about corporatism. I worry about governments, in a sense, setting demands and lines in the private sector. In many cases where the government doesn't really understand the markets or what they're intervening in and are unlikely to produce better outcomes. I mean, what we saw in the United States during COVID is the United States actually turned to the private sectors for innovation and capability and capacity. And the government management was actually the not best way to go. So I do think we have to approach this in a cautious manner and not essentially turn the hands of everybody's freedom and independence and innovation and creativity and livelihoods and freedom to make their own decisions over to a more planned economy, which promises better outcomes. But I don't know if we actually have confidence in it.
James Carafano, and you also heard from Mariana Mazzucato.